Thank you for listening to Light of the Vedas. This is your host, Sri Sachinandan Das. We've been discussing in previous episodes the Srimad Bhagavatam or Bhagavat Purana, which is the highest pinnacle of Vedic literature. And if you understand the Bhagavat Purana and have spiritual revelation of its true nature, then you can understand the Vedas very clearly. It's just like if you climb to the top of a mountain and you stand at the peak, you can look down 360 degrees at all the various pathways which lead up the mountain. So similarly, one who is Brahman realized or enlightened, who understands reality beyond material existence and the true spiritual nature of things, they can look down upon the various Vedic literatures and see clearly their proper relationship with each other, and see clearly the various paths which lead upwards towards transcendence, which are called the paths of yoga. And the Bhagavat Purana really represents that highest path of yoga and the highest revelation of the absolute truth, namely the personality of God, the form of God, the qualities of God, who He's like as an individual, the various names of God, and what are His various activities, especially the Supreme Lord or the one transcendent God, Vishnu or Krishna. He descends into the world as the avatar. And one of the main purposes of the avatar, the incarnation, is to reveal himself to the world. And there's a spiritual tradition where qualified individuals will hear and chant these pastimes or activities of these avatars and meditate upon them very deeply. And in doing so, they become purified and they attain the highest stages of consciousness. But in order to hear these activities, in order to sort of be able to connect to this level of revelation, to sort of open the window into the activities and the personality of God, you have to have a certain pre-qualification. You have to be sufficiently spiritually advanced. And this is the truth with most Vedic literatures, that they are to a certain degree secret. The information within them is not meant for the general public. In fact, that's the reality of spiritual truth in itself, that the material reality forms a curtain. It's called Yogamaya in Sanskrit. Mahabharata. It covers the entire spiritual truth behind reality, where essentially as souls, spirit souls, we're trapped and encaged within matter, and due to the heavy, thick darkness and the illusory nature of this matter, we can't really see through to the true spiritual reality behind matter. And so it forms a kind of a block or a curtain which doesn't allow us to see spiritual truth. And the various yoga systems are ways in which we purify our consciousness and we develop transcendental knowledge, sort of like the light of the soul is ignited. And just like you may have a small fire and you ignite it, and then you keep feeding fuel, and gradually it grows brighter and brighter and brighter. So similarly, the systems of yoga, they ignite the consciousness of the soul who's entrapped within matter, and that consciousness becomes brighter and brighter and brighter, and the individual becomes illuminated to the extent that by the light of their own soul, the light of thine own eye, right? They can see through the illusion of matter. That light illuminates matter and penetrates it until one can actually see the spiritual truth which exists behind everything. And in order to actually hear and understand the personality of God, you have to actually be quite illuminated. You can't be thick within the darkness of matter, right? You have to actually be purified to a certain extent, and the more that you're purified, the more you can taste the personality of God, the more that you can experience spiritual ecstasy when coming in contact with those subject matters. For an individual whose sort of their consciousness is bound within the darkness of matter, the topics of the avatars, the topics of Krishna or Vishnu, they're not very tasteful. In fact, one may even be repelled. Someone in very dark consciousness and very low consciousness will be repelled by topics of God or topics of the personality who is actually the supreme absolute truth. Just like you see in the traditional stories of vampires or something, if you bring out a crucifix, they're repelled by it, or you throw holy water on them, immediately they start to burn, it's like a painful experience for the consciousness. So the more that the entity is bound, the soul is bound within matter, and the more that the consciousness is enveloped by darkness and ignorance and illusion and pain, then those topics can even be painful. But by listening to them and receiving them from the proper source, and oneself being the proper hearer, then gradually that light is ignited within oneself, and the more that you become purified, and the more that light begins to grow within you, the more tasteful those topics become, until they're quite nice, they're relishable. And then finally, when one attains spiritual consciousness, and one begins to rise beyond material illusion on a very high level of consciousness, having gradually reached that stage through the yoga processes, then when one hears spiritual subject matters about the avatars of the personality of God, then one feels like an onslaught, like a tidal wave of spiritual ecstasy, spiritual pleasure. So great that one immediately renounces all material attachment and goes running towards it, right? And it's not just spiritual ecstasy, it's the full flowering of the heart, right? Like the nature of the living being as a spark and part and parcel ultimately of God, a small spark of the divine fire. Then when the spark enters into the fire again, it reignites and attains its pure spiritual nature. It comes to its, it essentially lights on fire, and burns with its true beauty and its true flame-like quality of transcendental divine pleasure and happiness and joy. And yet, there's also a sense where the soul is by nature in a loving relationship with God, so that when the soul contacts God, then that inner love also flowers within one, and one's deepest needs and deepest desires are automatically satisfied. And essentially, we're looking to fulfill those deep needs within matter, but as soon as the soul recognizes God and sees God, then immediately those deep needs are satisfied. You immediately recognize, actually, this is what I've been looking for. I've been looking for God the whole time, right? I've been looking for love in all the wrong places. I've been absorbed in material existence, trying to satisfy my soul, and yet the soul can naturally be satisfied as soon as it feels God. Immediately the soul recognizes, oh, this is what I'm looking for. Just like if a fish, it's sort of like bouncing around on the floor, it jumped out of its fish tank, and it's just sort of gasping for air, and it's miserable. But as soon as you pick it up and throw it back in the fish tank, and if you've ever done that before, immediately they just start darting around, and flying very happily, very comfortably. It's like they're relieved. And so it's the same thing with the soul. When the soul actually experiences the true spiritual nature of God, or the personality of God, and feels that transcendental bliss from the spiritual world, immediately the soul becomes happy. Like the soul becomes very comfortable and joyful and satisfied. And so, but in order to experience that, one has to actually be qualified. You have to develop yourself through the spiritual path. And so there's a pre-qualification to hear, and we've discussed that in previous episodes, especially coming in a proper parampara, disciplic succession, a proper guru-disciple relationship which stretches back into history. And through these guru-disciple relationships, that's a requirement within the Vedas, Sagurum eva bhyacchet. The Upanishads say that you must actually approach a guru, and you must actually learn in that under the system of discipline given by that guru, and be guided by them. And they themselves also went through the same process and became a qualified disciple of their guru, and their guru did the same, and it goes back thousands of years. And in this way, each guru or each generation, they develop the spiritual qualification, and they hear from the proper source, and then they hand that information down themselves without changing or altering it, or sort of bastardizing it, or mixing it with material illusion. They preserve the true spiritual message, and they hand it down very gently. Just like if you have two men gathering fruit from a tree, and one climbs to the top branches and picks fruit, and he hands it down to someone a couple branches below him, and then maybe that individual then hands it down to someone another branch below him, and all the way like this so that the fruit is carefully handed down all the way to the ground. And so in the same way, the spiritual knowledge, or the true essence or purport of the Vedas, it's handed down through the disciplic succession. And the Vedas are like this gigantic tree. And they're very hard to understand, by your own intelligence, by your own power. And yet if you come in one of these authoritative lines, then that fruit, from the top branch of the Vedas, that highest knowledge of the Vedas and the true purport of the Vedas, it's handed down very carefully through generation after generation, so that you actually get the very essence of the Vedas. And so, you have to sort of start at the beginning, from where one is, to actually achieve this revelation. And so the first text that generally people will study in order to make spiritual advancement is the Bhagavad Gita. And the Bhagavad Gita is considered like the Bible of India. It's the core essential book. And as far as spiritual teachings go, it's kind of like the elementary mathematics. And then, when one is fully realized and understanding the Bhagavad Gita, having heard it from a proper source and the proper succession, and having put the principles within it into practice, and having studied it very carefully, then one can move on to higher subject matters. And so it's kind of like an introductory literature. In fact, it's called the Gita-upanishad because it has the authority of an Upanishad. It's very much like an Upanishad literature, and it's 700 verses, and it's situated within the Mahabharata. It's a portion of the Mahabharata. In fact, the Mahabharata, it tells the story of the Pandavas and Kurus, these two groups of cousins, who are essentially fighting over the kingdom. And one group of brothers, the Pandavas, are divine. They're basically exalted spiritual personalities who have the rightful claim to the kingdom. They're very detached from it, but nevertheless, in order to protect the people and establish religious principles, they should actually be the kings. Whereas their enemies, the Kauravas, are basically like very, very evil people. They're murderers. They're potential rapists. They try to murder the Pandavas on multiple occasions and try to humiliate them and destroy them. And they're really selfish and greedy individuals. And they shouldn't be taking charge of the kingdom. It won't be very good for the kingdom. And yet they're trying to steal it from the Pandavas. And so eventually it culminates into the war, the Battle of Kurukshetra. And it's the very climax of the Mahabharata, which is a gigantic literature. And then right in the midst of this climax, the Bhagavad Gita takes place. You have the two armies are assembled on the battlefield, and each side is facing each other and about to charge. And then in the midst of this, you have Krishna and Arjuna coming. They pull a chariot in the midst of the two armies, and there's a philosophical discussion that happens. And there are many subjects which are discussed within the Bhagavad Gita. Foremost, you'll find the topic of yoga. The various systems of yoga are discussed, and an entire picture of spiritual life is essentially given, it doesn't specifically refer to Hinduism. It means spiritual life in general, in a universal sense. That if you really truly understand Bhagavad Gita, and you understand all the different yoga systems, the different types of spiritual practice, and you understand how they relate to each other and how they relate to the absolute truth, and on what level one acts and in what stage of consciousness, then when you look across the various religions and spiritual practices in the world, it's kind of like a roadmap to religion. It's a roadmap to freeing oneself of material illusion and material bondage. And there's many other subjects discussed too. A entire picture of material and spiritual reality is given. The nature of the universe, the nature of material existence, the nature of the soul, the nature of God, the nature of surrender to God, and all sorts of information about how the universe is constructed, how karma works, the modes of nature, the various qualities of conditioned existence, both those qualities which lead upward and the qualities which lead downward. So an entire picture of reality is given on top of a description of the various systems of yoga. And the Bhagavad Gita begins with the king Dhritarashtra, who is responsible for the entire war. He's the one behind the scenes provoking his wicked sons, Duryodhan and Dushasan, to try to steal the kingdom from the Pandavas. And he's the relative of the Pandavas. He should see them as his own sons. In fact, they're sort of like under his care, almost like foster children. And yet he doesn't. He makes a distinction between his sons and the sons of Pandu, who is his brother. And so because of this distinction is based upon material consciousness, it's based upon illusion, it's based upon greed, and he wants his sons to inherit the kingdom rather than the rightful inheritors, the Pandavas, who are not only qualified by birth to rule the kingdom, but they're qualified by their spiritual qualities as well. Whereas his sons, they're not qualified, either by birth or by spiritual qualification. And yet, due to greed and illusion, he's pushing them forward, that he wants them to be the kings. And so he is somewhat an anxiety about the nature of the battle. What will happen? Will his sons win? Because he knows that the Pandavas are pious. And they're fighting in a holy place known as Kurukshetra. And so the beginning of the Bhagavad Gita is kind of like the background of how the Bhagavad Gita fits into the Mahabharata itself. There's a description of how all the soldiers are arrayed on the battlefield in their military formations, and they're prepared to fight. And in fact, the conch shells are blown, which is kind of like the trumpet sound, which indicates that the armies will now charge towards each other. But instead of charging together in the midst of the two armies, one chariot pulls out into the middle, and it's driven by Krishna, and it's carrying the great hero of the Mahabharata, Arjuna. And Krishna is an avatar. He is the personality of God. He is God himself manifest upon the earth. And he's there taking the position of a humble servitor of his devotee and of his friend, Arjuna. And then guiding him into the midst of the both armies, he shows him his kinsmen on both sides. And Arjuna becomes overwhelmed with grief, becomes overwhelmed with lamentation. In fact, his hands begin shaking, and he sort of loses his sense of composure and even drops his bow. And he's overwhelmed by emotions. Because even though it's his duty to fight in this particular battle and to protect the people from the wicked individuals trying to take the kingdom, still those individuals are his relatives, and they're people that he's known since his childhood. They're like his brothers practically. And also on that side of the battlefield are the individuals that have acted as his mentors and gurus, and even his own grandfather. And then on his side of the battlefield too, he sees his brothers and all of his friends and everybody, and he sees, they're about to die and they're about to kill each other. And so he becomes overwhelmed with emotion. And he begins to present various arguments to Krishna as to why he shouldn't do his duty as a warrior and a prince of fighting and protecting Dharma, and standing for what is right. And he begins to present, argument after argument. First of all, he's overwhelmed with compassion for them. He doesn't want to see them hurt, which is understandable. He's a devotee of God, and he's a pure-hearted person. So naturally, as a soft-hearted person, he doesn't want to harm anyone, and to speak of his own relatives. And he's also worried about he's found himself in a situation where he doesn't see any good for himself. Like sometimes life puts us into situations where there's nothing that we want in the situation. Like we're forced to be in a situation where we don't see anything that's good for us. There's no way that we can enjoy from the situation, and yet we're being forced to fight. We're being forced to deal with we're sort of put by life itself into a conundrum where we're forced to just gruel it out and work through a situation in which we don't see any benefit for ourselves. And so this is one of his issues as well. It's like, why am I here fighting in this battle? If I win, then all of my family members will be dead. The people that I care for will be dead. And if I lose, I'll be dead. I don't want a kingdom that much. Not only that, but if we win the kingdom, it'll be drenched in blood. Like, how am I going to enjoy a kingdom which is I've had to kill my family for? Right? So this is his predicament. And he's also cautious about committing sin. In Vedic culture, the environment in which Arjuna comes from, he's very much conscious of the degrading nature of sinful activities. You can be degraded, especially into an animal form of life. You can lose the opportunity of spiritual advancement, which is in the human form of life, and you're sort of bound within a lower state of consciousness. And you can even go to hell, to temporarily work off the sins acquired by doing things like killing people or raping people, robbing from people. And so he sees that I'm on this battlefield and I'm prepared to fight people who are like my gurus. They're like my teachers and my elder family members. And if I kill them, this is very sinful. Killing your grandfather, that's unheard of. And so he's afraid that I may get sinful reactions from this. I'm about to commit some serious sinful activities by fighting these particular individuals. And he also sees that by fighting them, these are like the leaders of society. They're the princes and kings of society. And if they're destroyed, then the whole moral situation of society collapses. These are the individuals who are upholding right and wrong within society. And if they leave, then society will become degraded and materialistic. And then also there's a sense of just confusion. He's just bewildered by the situation. It's so overwhelming. And so he presents all these different doubts to Krishna. And then, at least in the beginning of the Bhagavad Gita, Krishna is more or less addressing these various doubts one after the other. At one point, Arjuna surrenders and says that I accept you as my spiritual teacher, and you please instruct me and tell me what I should do. I'm totally bewildered, and no longer do I see you as my friend, because that's his relationship with Krishna. He's like his best friend. They're really close, intimate associates. But I actually see you as my guru, so please instruct me. I surrender to you. And so Krishna begins with giving him spiritual instruction. And the first instruction he gives him is that you're not the body. He goes into great detail talking about the difference between the body and the soul. And this is the preliminary lesson of spiritual life, is that we are not these gross temporary material bodies, but rather we're spirit souls that exist within the bodies. And material energy, of which this body is composed, is temporary, and it's constantly changing, it's constantly moving. It doesn't exist, it doesn't last for very long. It's sure to die, it's sure to disintegrate and melt back into the elements. Whereas the soul doesn't disintegrate. The soul can't be killed. If you slash someone with a sword, you're never killing the soul. You can only slash and kill the body. But the soul lives on. The soul is pure spiritual energy which exists beyond matter, and it's eternal. It's never destroyed. Whereas the body is always going through changes. Even within this particular lifetime, our body is constantly changing. The body that we had when we were a child, that body's completely gone, right? Even the scientific perspective is that every 7 years or so, the majority of the body is replaced with new and fresh cells. So the body's constantly undergoing changing, whereas the soul, that is us, it's always the same. It always remains. It's the witness. It's experiencing the body and the change of the body. And for this reason, one shouldn't lament for the body and for the material situation in general, but rather one should remain fixed in their duty. And one has to transcend the suffering and the misery associated with the body, and being fixed in spiritual knowledge of the true spirit self. Then one has to tolerate the various changes and movements, the fluctuations of happiness and distress and heat and cold of the material existence. One has to tolerate using spiritual knowledge. And at the same time, one shouldn't lament or be too disturbed about the temporary nature of reality. And then Krishna goes into talking about another very, very important topic within the Bhagavad Gita, one of the prime topics, which is karma yoga, also known as buddhi yoga within the Bhagavad Gita. And it's essentially this, that we all have our duties to perform according to our body. The scriptures, the Vedic scriptures, according to an individual's nature, they prescribe a certain job for them to do. For example, the warrior has his job, the priest has his job. Basically, according to our nature, we have certain responsibilities. And we see this in normal, modern life, that you get up in the morning and you go to work, and that job is essentially your dharma. It's work that you do according to your nature. And there's responsibilities that you have within that job. And then coming home, you have your family. That's also your dharma. It's your responsibilities. And so due to our nature, our material existence that we're experiencing, we have certain responsibilities and ways in which we must act. And these are, within Vedic culture, they're guided by the Vedic literatures themselves. And so Krishna urges that one perform these particular duties but one has to do it in a detached state of consciousness. And the detachment really comes from transcendental knowledge, just like we're talking about the body is separate from the soul, and the soul is the true spirit self, and the soul exists beyond the body. So that's transcendental knowledge. And karma yoga means to act in transcendental knowledge. And in this way, you're no longer bound by karma. Karma it's not that all of the activities you perform in the world just give you karma. Karma is the response to your consciousness of trying to enjoy through your actions. Like if you do an activity and you want to enjoy the fruits of it, you're trying to get something out of it, you're trying to enjoy through that action, then you're putting that energy out into the world and it sort of boomerangs back to you. It finds its way back. It's just, and the reason it's doing that is because you wanted to enjoy the fruits. It's the result of your desire to get it back. So you act in a certain way with the world with the desire to enjoy, and it puts out the sort of like the chain reaction of those activities, and it pushes out away from you into the world, but because you wanted to enjoy the fruits, it'll gradually make its way back to you and give you the fruits. And this is called karma. And when we call something good karma or bad karma, we're sort of commenting on the quality of those fruits. Bad karma is essentially you act away in the world in a certain way in which the reaction when it gets to you will not be something that you want. Like you murder somebody, you steal from somebody. This is against the principles of the scripture. And therefore, when you perform that activity, and you're doing it in the desire to enjoy the fruits, when that activity comes back to you, somebody's going to rob from you. Somebody's going to murder you. And therefore we call that bad karma. It's essentially you acted in ignorance. And good karma means that when you act in the world, you act with knowledge, although it's still selfish, like you still want to enjoy the fruits of your work, but you're going to do good work. You're going to do work which is in accordance with religious principles. And therefore, you're going to give charity to somebody. There's a man who's struggling and suffering. He's freezing. He's homeless. And you somehow take him into your home and you give him a nice meal and you treat him very nicely and allow him to stay in the guest room and use the bath and you give him money as he leaves and, you take care of people and you're charitable and you're kind to people. You treat people as you'd want to be treated. But you're doing it with the overall mood of doing it is that you want to enjoy being a good person. And the result is that karma will then come back to you, that people will take care of you. Like if you give somebody $5 in this lifetime, in the next life, $5 will be given to you, or you may find it on the street or something. And of course, the more spiritually qualified the individual that you give to or take care of, then that result is magnified. Like if you give $5 to a very saintly person, it can come back to you as $1,000, and therefore the Vedic understanding is when you see wealth disparity, and you see certain individuals, everything is available to them in life, and whatever they desire practically comes to them. All the doors open as soon as they have a desire, and they live in in a very wealthy, comfortable environment with not much struggle. So this is due to performing pious actions in a previous life with the desire to enjoy the fruits. And so those pious, charitable, kind, generous, religious actions, they then come back to you in your next life as basically a good life. You're born in a nice family with lots of wealth and facility. You have a beautiful body. You're highly educated. You're strong and capable. And so all of these various qualities are symptomatic of doing pious and religious actions in a previous life. But what Krishna advises is that you perform your duties just like everyone else, but within that performing of duties, you annihilate that selfish motivation. You destroy the selfishness that's there by becoming illuminated or enlightened with transcendental knowledge. You understand the true nature of the soul, and you meditate upon Brahman, and you meditate upon the absolute truth, and in doing this, then you lose, as you gradually become more advanced, that selfish motivation in your actions, it disappears. And so that you're doing the actions just as a form of duty, with no personal desire to enjoy the fruits, and then your actions are no longer a source of bondage. You don't get any more karma. And the result of that is that you attain liberation, ultimately. after some time, all the karma that you previously put out into the world, it becomes exhausted. It all hits you, but you haven't been making new karma because you haven't been acting selfishly. And so when all of that karma is exhausted, then practically speaking, you're liberated from material existence. So thank you very much for listening. If you found value in this, please like and subscribe. If you're listening on iTunes, please visit srisachinandana.com/iTunes and leave a positive review. Thank you again, and we hope you'll join us next time on Light of the Vedas.